Aurora Brown and intersectional psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Content warning. This episode discusses themes of gender, sexuality, mental illness, and violence, including murder and queerphobic tropes in film. While we approach these topics critically and with care, some listeners may find parts of this discussion distressing. If you need to, take a break, or come back to it later with company. As always, listener well-being comes first. Welcome back to Intersectional Psychology, the podcast that explores psychology's role in promoting social justice. Today, we are checking into the Bates Motel. Yes, Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film Psycho, the movie that redefined horror and gave us the most famous shower scene in cinema history. But beneath the screams and the chocolate syrup blood, Psycho is also a story about repression, sexual, maternal, and cultural. It's about what happens when patriarchal ideas of masculinity start to crack, when desire can't find a safe outlet, and when mother won't stay buried. We'll be exploring Norman Bates not just as a killer, but as a mirror for how mid-century America pathologized femininity, demonized queerness, stigmatized mental illness, and blamed women for men's violence. From Ed Gein's farm to Freud's couch, from the final girl to the castrating mother, Psycho's legacy tells us as much about gender panic as it does about murder. Joining me to unpack all of this is Nicole Engelbrecht from True Crime South Africa. Unfortunately, my other guest for today has lost their voice, so they won't be joining us, but we wish them all the best for a speedy recovery. However, this is important because they are a clinical psychologist, and I haven't been able to find another clinical psychologist on such short notice. Many of the mental health issues we discuss today are outside my scope of practice as a registered counselor, so we won't be throwing around our own diagnoses and hypothesizing about mental health. All of the elements of mental illness that we discuss today are based on historical and documented evidence. So join us in Cabin 1 as together Nicole and I will ask the real question. When Norman Bates says, "We all go a little mad sometimes," whose madness is he really talking about? Just a quick heads up for anyone watching the video of this episode on YouTube. The video part of the next 2 minutes did not record, so there'll only be audio. But after 2 minutes, the video will be back in full Technicolor splendor. Well, not Technicolor. Technicolor is trademarked. It will be back in full HD. I don't know. The point is the video will be back, so you will get to see our beautiful faces. So enjoy. So Nicole, welcome back to Intersectional Psychology. It's lovely to have you here. Nicole is the host of True Crime South Africa, the podcast, the award-winning podcast, and the author of 4 books. Nicole will be joining us again on next week's episode, where we'll be discussing the ethics of true crime in more depth. But today we are talking about the 1960 horror film classic Psycho. So, Nicole, thank you for being here.
It's a huge pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Now, there are so many angles we could take to analyze this film, and there is already so much discourse and analysis out there on the filmmaking, on the technical aspects, on the gender, on the Hitchcock, and there are books and movies and documentaries and podcasts. So we are going to be looking specifically at its representation of mental health using an intersectional psychology lens. And even using such a narrow focus, I still don't think we'll be able to cover everything in this one episode, but we are going to do our best. I mean, even just the title of the film, Psycho, itself is already ableist. So there's a lot to discuss, but let's start, Nicole, with what is your relationship with the Psycho franchise?
I think like everyone, it sort of became a seminal movie that people in the horror genre, and I mean, I do love the horror genre. There's this idea of retrospective morality. Looking back at when I probably first viewed the movie, I viewed it through a very different lens than I probably do now. I guess when you know better, you do better. But of course, filmmakers didn't know much better back then. And I think, thinking back, I think the word psycho, I don't know whether that's when it started being bandied around, sort of out of context, but it certainly feels like it.
Nicole, have you seen any of the other films in the franchise or the TV series Bates Motel?
I have not seen the TV series. I'm very sure I've seen some of the others, but none of them really stand out to me at the moment, I must say.
Yeah, I don't think any of the sequels match up to, the original, but I, like you, kind of absorbed a lot of the elements of Psycho through like cultural osmosis, the music and the shower scene and all of those iconic moments. And I like to think of myself as a film buff, but when I was growing up, our access to films was very limited. And so by the time I actually got around to watching the full film, Psycho, I'd heard so much about it and heard that it was supposed to be one of the greatest films of all time. And I also knew a lot about Alfred Hitchcock and how cruel and abusive he was to some of his female performers, especially. And so when I watched Psycho for the first time, I was kind of like, I went in with this attitude of like, okay, come on, show me how good you are, not wanting to be impressed. And so I wasn't very impressed. I was like very judgmental. And I'd also seen a lot of other horror films, later horror films, that kind of took what was groundbreaking about Psycho and just like amped it up to the nth degree. So yeah, I wasn't very impressed. But then I watched Bates Motel and I really, really enjoyed that.
Okay.
I think it was, even more than the sequels, like a better exploration and a more interesting exploration of the dynamic between the mother and the son.
Okay.
Of the sequels, I only watched the sequels now when I was preparing for this podcast. And I actually really like the first sequel, so Psycho 2, because we'll talk about it a bit later, but I really like the representation of what it's like for someone who has been incarcerated, or I don't know if that's the right word, but someone who's been incarcerated as someone who's criminally insane, and then reintegrating back into the community and like all of the challenges involved there. And I think it actually does a really good job. let's dive right into the recap of this film. And we're going to recap and then we'll discuss.
Sounds good.
Picture it. A Friday afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona, 1960. The camera pans over the city and then rests on the window of a hotel room, perched there almost like a voyeuristic bird. Through the window, we see a blonde, conventionally attractive woman named Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh. She is lying on a bed in her white underwear, passively looking up at a tall, conventionally attractive man with dark hair and dark eyes named Sam Loomis and played by John Gavin. So Sam is shirtless but wearing trousers. Sam remarks that Marion hasn't even had a chance to eat her lunch. Why? Because they were having sex. Ooh. So we learn that Marion is running late to get back to her office. She's on a lunch break. And Sam tries to convince her to stay longer because he's visiting from the fictional town of Fairvale, California. Despite Sam's resistance, Marion is quite assertive and very effectively sets new boundaries for the relationship going forward. You know, she doesn't want to have to sneak around in secret because this is 1960 and the concept of free love is not quite mainstream yet, so she can't actually be known to fuck. So Marion says either they get married or Sam can only see her respectably in her house with her mother's picture on the mantle and in the company of her sister, Lila. So Sam says he can't get married yet because he has to pay off his father's debts, pay alimony, and get a home big enough to share with her. Just sounds like a lot of excuses. So Marion rushes back to her job in a real estate office where she's worked as a secretary for 10 years. So just then, their boss arrives with a client, Tom Cassidy, who turns out to be a very wealthy, very slimy man. Cassidy is buying his daughter a house as a wedding gift, and he sexually harasses Marion while showing her a photo of his 18-year-old quote-unquote baby and announcing that he is paying $40,000 cash, which today is equal to about 435,000 US dollars or 7.5 million rand. Marion's boss is a bit uneasy because it's not normal to whip out a huge wad of cash like that, which Cassidy does, tax evasion. But Cassidy says he never carries more than he can afford to lose. Marion's boss tells her to put the money in their safety deposit box at the bank and agrees that she can go home straight after the bank, while the client sexually harasses Marion some more. And she basically does like the bare minimum to smile and humor him and just be polite. But at this point, I was like, please, Marion, rob him, like take his money. And apparently Marion heard me because sometime later we see her at home getting dressed. She looks anxiously at something on the bed. It's the $40,000 cash. And next to the money is an open suitcase, fully packed. So is Marion running away with the money? Yes. And how do we know that? Because now her underwear is black because she's gone to the dark side. So next we see Marion driving in her car, imagining what Sam will say when she turns up with $40,000 cash. She's stopped at some traffic lights, and who should cross the road right in front of her? Why, it's her boss and his client. So her boss nods politely at her, but then a look of confusion crosses his face. Didn't Marion say she was going to spend the weekend in bed with her headache? So where is she going? Marion, who was already looking nervous, is now extremely anxious. And Nicole, honestly, if I'd been Marion, this is the point where I would have decided to just like turn around and give up whatever wild plan I had and, you know, just beg forgiveness.
100%. That's certainly where I would have lost my nerve myself.
Yeah, so, but not Marion. She's braver than all of us, or I don't know. And so this whole time, Bernard, Herman's iconic, strings only score is pumping along like the blood in your ears when you're filled with adrenaline and your sympathetic nervous system is activated. So Marion keeps driving into darkness, through the night, to the point where she is falling asleep at the wheel. She pulls over to sleep and is awoken by a highway patrol officer knocking on her window, asking why is she parked on the side of the road and why is she acting super suspicious. Like she's not afraid to, challenge this police officer, but she's also, not a very good liar. So this cop is also like quite menacing. He's wearing sunglasses, aviators, so you can't see his eyes. And he's leading into the car much closer than necessary. And still, she doesn't turn around. So eventually, she gets to Bakersfield, California, where the cop, who has followed her because she looks so suspicious, watches her from across the road as she trades in her car. I looked up this route on Google Maps, and even if she hadn't stopped to sleep, from Phoenix to Bakersfield is a 7-hour, 40 minutes drive. And she has not once thought about turning around and giving back the money. I was like, either the power of love is the real mental illness in this film, or Sam Loomis is like really laying down some magic dick. Sorry, Nicole.
No, agreed. Absolutely. No, absolutely.
And so, also, like, what even is the point of trading in her car while the cop watches her? Like, wasn't the whole point of trading in her car to get the cop or to get a car that the cop wouldn't recognize? Unless
Exactly.
it was, yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
No.
Marion keeps driving, and by now it is nighttime again, Saturday night, and it's raining. As the water comes showering down, the windscreen wipers slice through the rain like knives through blood? Question mark. Foreshadowing. Anyway, eventually visibility is so poor that Marion pulls over into the parking lot of the Bates Motel. Dun dun dun. And there's no one in the motel office when Marion arrives, but she does see the silhouette of a tall, slender woman in a window of the big house on the hill, looming like a shadow over the hotel. Marion hoots the horn of her car, and soon a tall, slender man skips down the steps from the house. This is Norman Bates, played by Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Perkins. Very different person.
Different Anthony.
So Marion checks into the motel, and we find out that there are currently no other guests because the motel doesn't get much traffic since the highway was moved away. It's very secluded. Marion signs the guest register under a pseudonym and lies unnecessarily about where she's from. And Norman seems to pick up that she is lying. And I don't know if I was reading too much into this, but it seemed like the fact that she was lying and hiding something made him change his mind about which room to give her. Almost as if, she's, not as, not a good girl, shall we say.
Yeah, I could see that.
So he hands her the keys for room 1, which happens to be adjacent to his office and parlour. Norman shows Marion into her room. He seems quite personable and charming, but he becomes flustered as he points out the bathroom. Like he can't even say the word bathroom, as if something inside of him finds it obscene to discuss. Finally, he invites Marion to join him for a simple supper of sandwiches and milk. Kind of like what you would feed a child. And I could imagine Marion thinking like, another man I need to humor. Like she must be so exhausted. Anyway, Marion begins to unpack. She takes out the big envelope of money that she stole, but she can't settle on where to hide the money for safekeeping. Eventually, she folds it up in the newspaper she bought at the car dealership earlier and places the paper on the bedside table. And I'm like, it's actually a pretty good hiding place as long as no one decides to read the news.
Absolutely.
But just then, Marion overhears Norman arguing with his mother, who is shaming him and shaming Marion for supposedly having ulterior motives for eating together. Through her window, Marion sees Norman coming down the steps carrying a tray of food. She goes to meet him and says, "I've caused you some trouble." Norman blanches and says, mortified, that he wishes one could apologize for other people. And in that moment, I just wanted to wrap him up and hold this sweet, sensitive, beautiful young man. And I think this might also have been the moment where Marion kind of lets her guard down with him.
Mm.
And it is quite interesting because I think, in every scene that we've seen her so far, Marion is the most well spoken, eloquent, and, assertive person that she's met, and most intelligent person in the room. And for the first time, it kind of seems like she's met someone who she could actually have a proper conversation with and who's like on her level. It's just that Norman has a lot of baggage.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
And so they go to Norman's parlor behind the reception area, which is full of taxidermied birds. Norman watches Marianne eat and says she eats like a bird, which is funny because her surname is Crane and she comes from a city called Phoenix. They discuss his mother and institutional healthcare and the private traps that we are all in. And I want to come back to this whole conversation in our discussion because I think it gives us one of the clearest windows into Norman's character, psyche, situation, as well as into, I don't know, the last real look that we get into Marian's interiority. So then Marion goes back to her room where she calculates how much money she spent so far because she has decided to return to Phoenix and give back the money. Norman watches her undressing through a peephole in the wall. So then Marion gets into the shower and she seems to find relief in having made a decision and cleansing the crime from her under the hot water. But then Norman's mother comes in and stabs Marianne to death in the shower, and we have, the iconic screeching violins that have now reached fever pitch. Moments later, Norman discovers Marianne's body and he is horrified. He rushes to help her, but it's too late. She dead. So then Norman cleans up the crime scene in one of the longest scenes in the film. Like, he's really meticulous. And he wraps her body up in the shower curtain and places it in the boot or the trunk of her car, along with all her belongings, including the newspaper containing the $40,000 cash, which he doesn't even realize is there. And then he pushes the car into the swamp behind the cabins. So now we cut to Marion's boyfriend, Sam, a week later, who is writing her a letter saying, "You know what? You're right. We don't need money to get married. I'd rather be with you in poverty than be without you in also poverty." Gee, thanks, Sam. I guess late is not always better than never. Just then, Marion's sister, Lila, played by Vera Miles, turns up at the hardware store where Sam works because she thinks Marion is there with the $40,000 cash that she stole. And Sam seems not very concerned that the supposed love of his life is missing with a chunk of cash that could solve all his problems. And then a private investigator named Milton Arbogast, played by Martin Balsam, also shows up at Sam's workplace. It seems he's been hired by Tom Cassidy, the creep who Marion stole the money from.
Yeah.
And Arbogast privately investigates by going to all the hotels and motels in the area to try to find Marion. Finally, he gets to the Bates Motel. Arbogast has a sample of Marion's handwriting, which he matches to the registry book at the Bates Motel, and Arbogast starts interrogating Norman, who's acting quite suspiciously again. Like, once he gets caught in a lie, Norman starts answering questions like a nervous little child and just makes up like silly, easily disprovable lies just to, over comply and get it over with.
Absolutely.
But then Arbogast spots Norman's mother through the window of the main house and he wants to question her. But Norman is like, nah, goodbye now. So Arbogast phones Sam and Lila to tell them about the Bates Motel, but then he goes back there and he sneaks into the house to find Mrs. Bates. But as he's climbing up the stairs, Mrs. Bates, who seems quite spry for an old lady, charges at him and stabs Arbogast, and he falls backwards, landing at the foot of the stairs. Meanwhile, Lila is getting quite antsy because Arbogast is taking longer than he said he would, but Sam is like, nah, let's just do nothing and keep waiting. And again, whatever Marion saw in this guy is not really on display in this movie.
Indeed.
But I mean, he's cute, but that's about it. So Lila convinces Sam to go check out the Bates Motel, but there's no Arbogast. And we see Norman standing by the swamp, implying he's pushed Arbogast and his car into the swamp too. And at this point, I was like, okay, but how deep is this swamp though? Because, we find out later this is like at least the fourth person whose body and belongings and possibly motor vehicle Norman has disposed of in this way and stacked up in the exact same spot in the swamp.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same thing.
It's so random. So then Lila takes Sam to the deputy sheriff's house in the middle of the night and wakes him and his wife up out of bed. And the sheriff is like, well, Marion is an adult who seems to have run away with $40,000 cash. I wouldn't call that missing. And also, Arbogast doesn't seem to be much of an investigator because Mrs. Bates has been dead for 10 years. She killed herself and her lover when she found out that he was married. And then Sam is like, but I also saw an elderly woman in the window too. So then the sheriff is like, well, then who's the woman buried in Mrs. Bates's grave? And so Lila and Sam kind of give up on the cops and go to Bates Motel themselves. They meet Norman and check in, pretending to be a married couple. They think that Norman stole the $40,000 cash from Marion. Sam tries to distract Norman while Lila goes up to the house to question Mrs. Bates. She snoops around Mother's bedroom and then in Norman's bedroom. And Norman's bedroom is very childlike. It contains like old stuffed animals and toys, but also a record of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony and possibly a book of Victorian pornography. So meanwhile, Sam is questioning Norman, and Norman is kind of being normal and affable, but Sam is like full on flirting with him in like also a slightly menacing way. Like, Sam is downright cruising Norman. And to be honest, I thought there was like more sexual chemistry between Sam and Norman here than between Sam and Marion in the opening scene of the film.
Yes, indeed.
But, Sam's questioning is also not very subtle, so soon their interaction becomes belligerent and Norman knocks Sam out. Back in the main house, Lila is now going down into the fruit cellar where she finds Mrs. Bates sitting in a chair with her back to Lila. But then Mrs. Bates's chair spins around and twist, she's been a skeleton this whole time. And just as Lila is taking this all in, another Mrs. Bates bursts in brandishing a knife. But wait, this Mrs. Bates is actually Norman wearing a wig and a dress, and he's going to stab Lila. But then Sam runs in behind Norman and stops him. A very abrupt cut to a courthouse where a psychiatrist who has just interviewed Norman off screen explains to Lila and Sam and the cops that Norman killed Marion, Arbogast, and at least 2 other young people. So the psychiatrist is played by theatre actor Simon Oakland, and I think he truly grasped with both hands Shakespeare's idea that all the world is a stage, because his delivery of this monologue is like a camp masterpiece, even if the actual psychological analysis is very 1950s. So basically he tells the group that Norman no longer really exists, only his mother does. So about 10 years earlier, Norman killed his mother and her lover after feeling abandoned and jealous. Overwhelmed with guilt, he couldn't accept what he'd done, so he dug up her body, preserved it, and created an alternate personality to keep her alive. So from then on, Norman's identity was divided. Sometimes he was himself, and sometimes he became mother. The two sides even carried on conversations with each other. Whenever Norman felt desire for another woman, the jealous mother side would take control and commit murder to, protect their bond. while Norman's conscious self repressed any awareness of what had happened. Over time, the alternate personality completely took over. By the time of his arrest, Norman's own identity had been entirely replaced by Mother, who now believes she's innocent and that Norman is the one responsible for all the killings, or at least that's what she's telling people. Meanwhile, Marion's car, which contains her remains and the stolen money, is pulled from the swamp, almost like, the repressed urges or the repressed personality of Mother has now surfaced and is fully there.
Visible.
Anyway.
Yeah. If we start in the beginning with the representation of Marion, it seems, knowing, as you said, what Hitchcock's view on women was, I wonder how she was really sort of display. It was almost like her and her sister were sort of representative of the sort of like two sides of a woman. Like Marion was the bad one, and her sister was the good half. I don't know if that sort of came through for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely see that. And, in some of the analysis I read of this film, they spoke a lot about how Hitchcock played with like the uncanny valley of doppelgangers or doubles. So, Marion and her sister look quite similar. Sam and Norman look quite similar. And so there's all of these pairings in the film that represent like different sides of gender and of personalities. So I can definitely see how, Marion would be the dark side and Lila would be like the good one. But it was also interesting because like Marion was very assertive. So I think Hitchcock, he did have problematic views of women and treated women problematically. But also in this film, he played a lot with gender fluidity. Like Marion was the more dominant one in her relationship with Sam.
Yeah.
And so was Lila. Lila was also more dominant with Sam. Like, I mean, I hate this whole talk of alpha and beta males and like this miserable masculinity masquerade. But to borrow that language a bit, like Sam is very much a beta. Like he doesn't do anything unless he's told to. And yeah, he will, even follow like the lead of women. And then Norman as well is more feline in shape almost, like quote unquote effeminate.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of duality in the movie, like you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. It's interesting because really all the characters in the movie, if I think of the male characters, there aren't really very many that are not in some way being told what to do by women. Even internally for Norman, even though he ended up, he's taken his mother's life, she's still really controlling him after her death, which is quite interesting.
Absolutely. And it's also challenging though, because the film, I don't think the film and the creators of this film really even thought about this, but the concept of, or the character of Mother who is controlling Norman, like the mother side of Norman, it's filtered through his lens and like his idea of what his mother was like. And I think over time it's kind of taken on like almost a caricature in his mind. Like we don't actually know what Norman's mother really was like in life. And we only have his idea of her and how he expresses that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, if I look at this sort of from a criminological perspective, it's interesting how around that time, I think these ideas were being developed that a lot of sort of violent men had their roots in some sort of dysfunctional relationship with their mother. That's when this idea of the school of psychology came about. And I wonder if that's sort of quite rooted in this movie as well. And we saw that coming forward in many portrayals in future sort of films and other sort of pop culture pieces.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you touched on something really important. And I think you identified something very relevant, because the screenwriter of this movie, obviously it was based on the book, but like they changed the book quite a bit. And the screenwriter of the film, I watched an interview with him and he literally said he was in psychoanalysis at the time and he based a lot of the psychoanalytical content of the film on his own experiences and his own relationship with his mother and all of the stuff that had been spoken about. Yeah, Freud and Lacan and all of these ideas about the domineering mother.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit about, the historical context, and Norman Bates was inspired, the character of Norman Bates was inspired by a real life person. I don't know how much you know about Ed Gein. I mean, you're the true crime expert.
Yeah, I think it is obviously a name that's quite well known now as well, because there's just been a new documentary produced about him through Netflix.
Hey, this is future Aurora, just dropping in with a quick note. The series that Nicole is referencing is Ryan Murphy's Monster, the Ed Gein story on Netflix, which is definitely not a documentary. I don't think Nicole has watched it because she actually values her time and makes much better life choices than I do. But I have watched it so that you don't have to. And I can tell you it is absolute trash, which, depending on your tastes, is maybe even a reason to watch it. But it completely distorts the facts of Ed Gein's life and mixes them in with many of the completely fictitious fables and myths that have built up around him, as well as fabricating some completely original, wild inaccuracies like characters or people that didn't exist, events that didn't exist, stuff that never happened, and bizarre fantasy sequences that make no historical or contextual sense. So, yeah, you can watch it if you want to, but just know it is definitely not a documentary. In fact, I think it is quite a damaging, exploitative, and sensationalist depiction of mental illness and violent crime. And honestly, the 65-year-old film Psycho contains more nuance and fleshed out characters than this brand new series. So let's get back to the episode on Psycho.
But yeah, I think I'm quite familiar with his crimes and also his connections with mother issues as well. Yeah, so I think Ed, some of the crimes that he committed were, I think, quite different from other serial killers in that he was quite intimately connected with body parts, skin and sort of heads. And, there were accusations that he was committing fellatio on severed heads and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I think what's interesting about Ed to me, and he was obviously arrested and spent many of the rest, good part of his life in prison. What's interesting about Ed to me is that if I look at a South African perspective, there are people exactly, serial killers exactly like Ed that have gone on to inspire sort of on the South African side. We've had serial killers, for instance, that kill in our cane fields, and they, one specific killer would tie little ribbons of material to the sugarcane. And if you look in any sort of fictionalized form of television produced around South African serial killers, you'll see elements of that killer in the killers in these movies. It's almost always in sugarcane fields. You often see the little pieces of material fluttering in the wind, and it all harks back to that original serial killer. which has been very much what Ed Gein, I think, has been to popular culture in America and probably Canada as well.
Yeah. And it is interesting that he has, this reputation as a serial killer because, I mean, so he was convicted of 2 murders, I
Mm,
think, and people suspect him of more,
mm,
although he was primarily like a grave robber
mm,
and also had a very close relationship with his mother. And I think his mother has kind of been demonized in culture as well, in terms of that she was very religious and very repressive and also had very critical views of women. Apparently, there was so she as she got older, Ed Gein's father died when Ed was young, and Ed was very close to his mother, and his mother wouldn't let them play with other kids. They lived on a farm, very isolated. And I think as she got older, Ed looked after her. So I think there are a lot of those kind of themes here in Psycho. But what isn't really spoken about a lot is that Ed Gein also had an extremely abusive father,
mm,
and his physical and verbal abuse of their mother and of the 2 young boys was well established.
mm,
Whereas all of these things that we know about his mother came out through interviews with Ed after he was
mm,
arrested. And the psychological report for Ed Gein also says that he was extremely suggestible and he just kind of agreed to whatever the people were saying and suggesting to him. So it's evolved into the original serial killer kind of myth and this monster mother myth. But there's so much of that story that is not really recognized and established
mm,
in popular culture. And I think Psycho has really, I don't know, entrenched that in popular culture and spawned a whole bunch of copycat films or
mm,
inspired other franchises.
mm,
So I think the list is incredibly long of horror franchises that include cross dressing or
mm,
transgender or transphobic coded serial killers.
mm.
And it's actually wild because the number of trans psycho killers in popular media is so disproportionate to the actual number of
Reality,
even
yeah.
just normal trans people in society, let alone the very like minuscule number of trans people who are violent.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the whole mother thing is, I mean, we see that in reality, even, no matter what the crime is, if there's a male killer, especially if he's younger, the mother is almost equally demonized as the
Mm.
killer son is. There's always a question of, well, what did she do to create such a being? So that definitely happens in reality as well.
Absolutely. And if we go to the last scene in the film where the psychiatrist is kind of discussing not Ed, Norman's diagnosis.
Mm.
What did you think about that?
Today I have a feeling of that was really glossed over, and you're trying to summarize a really complex issue in a very short time. And it was almost like this, the mental health aspect was sort of like encapsulated into this sort of 3 minutes monologue which didn't
Mm.
really work for me. And as
Mm.
you've mentioned earlier, I mean, we know now that a lot of what he was saying in that monologue is deeply problematic from a science perspective, and what we know now about mental health. It didn't ring true to me simply because I know what I know now. But I think if I was watching that in the '60s, it would probably make complete sense to me,
Mm.
which is concerning because I wonder how much that impacted other people with mental health issues, real mental health issues, and how they were seen at the time.
Absolutely. Nowadays, mental health practitioners generally agree that Norman suffered from dissociative identity disorder, which wasn't even a diagnosis back then. It was the closest thing in the DSM. It was still the DSM-1 in 1960, was schizophrenia. And that is what Ed Gein was diagnosed with. But I think over time, the reason diagnoses have changed and grown in number is because we've gotten a better understanding of the specificity of different disorders and different mental health conditions. And schizophrenia back then, all of the things that would have been categorized as schizophrenia in 1960, many of them are now split into different disorders or different categories. And then the psychiatrist also threw in this like one line where I think it was Lila who asked, why was Norman dressed like Mrs. Bates? And one of the cops said, oh, he used an outdated word for someone who's trans. And the psychiatrist was like, no, not exactly. Like, Norman didn't want to be a woman. He wanted to be his mother. Or, when he was dressing up, rather, he was his mother. He wasn't a woman. I'm trans. I don't think Norman was trans. I don't think he wanted to be a woman. There are some trans people who have claimed some of the trans characters in films, even though the representations are problematic. I think sometimes when there's no representation, you kind of latch onto anything that makes you feel seen. Firstly, I want to say, even if he was trans, like, that wouldn't mean anything about, or it wouldn't have any impact on like real trans people out in the world, because more trans people are more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrators.
Yeah.
And most of us are not running around, murdering blondes and polluting swamps, just like most people with schizophrenia or most people with DID are not running around murdering people. So the mental illness and the gender identity, whatever it is, have no bearing on his crimes. They have no bearing on other people who also suffer from those conditions.
Absolutely. But it's just another convenient way for people at that time to other him. It's a convenient, because that being trans, or however they viewed it at the time, would be something that so many people still at that time would frown upon, that it would be a very convenient way to make them even more different from the so-called ordinary person, which is, I guess, what they were trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
Mental space that the so-called normal person cannot fathom.
And I think it also, even like we spoke a little bit about gender fluidity and the interplay between the woman being more dominant in the film, which is typically considered a more masculine trait, which is just, a cis hetero patriarchy. Also the gender fluidity and the sexual fluidity between Sam and Norman. It was interesting when, even though Sam was coming across, like, Sam, as I said, he was more submissive with the woman. And then when he went to try and be the alpha man, when he was trying to intimidate Norman, he actually came across as like quite menacing, because it was almost like he was performing this masculinity and he overdid it. But Norman, who was supposedly the weaker or more effeminate one, managed to overpower him and knock him out. And yet when Norman was dressed as a woman, then Sam was able to overpower him. So I think the whole movie, throughout the film, with all of the characters, the film is trying to kind of destabilize the safety that men especially, I think, get from the cis heteropatriarchal society that they've built. Just destabilizing those gender norms.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. There's one thing that strikes me as interesting about the bringing up of DID in this movie, and what I guess would have
Mm.
been called multiple personality disorder. Well, not at the time, but just after that. Now we call it DID. Is that in the years that followed, there was a whole rash of American serial killers that
Mm.
attempted to use DID as their defense.
Mm.
And interestingly, I mean, I cannot say in any way that it started with Psycho, but I think that it was very clear that they had no understanding of how DID is actually diagnosed, because most of them did not get away with using that as their defense, because
Mm.
simple things like one of the dissociative personalities did not usually know what the other one is doing.
Mm.
There's no cross identity awareness, and fugue state wasn't present. There was like sort of this omniscient awareness, which we know does not exist in DID, in true DID. So that was interesting to me, was how many serial killers, sort of 70s and 80s, and even a few in the early 90s, tried to use DID as their defense, claiming that they were almost Norman Bates-esque, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, many in America, especially, you had all these men coming home from the Korean War and the Vietnam War and suffering from PTSD and having seen horrific things, having committed atrocious things, and grappling to live with that. And I'm sure that must have had an impact on,
Sure.
if not their criminal behavior at home, perhaps, the way that they impacted society at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with you there. I think add to that this is sort of also when people started dabbling in hallucinogenic drugs, things like LSD and magic mushrooms and all of that sort of thing on quite a high level. So that could only have, because a lot of people wouldn't have necessarily understood that there's a difference between an actual mental health episode and whatever is produced by a hallucinator, a drug that makes you hallucinate.
Psycho and then all of these other factors that we've spoken about caused a lot of people to conflate, even in the years following, to conflate DID with schizophrenia. And I think, if you go to a lay person on the street today and ask them what the difference is between DID and schizophrenia, they might also not be able to explain it. Probably not. So, yeah, I think the film has done a lot of damage to marginalized people with mental illness, or people who are gender non-conforming or queer in some way. First, Marion invites Norman into her room to eat their supper. So Marion is a bit taken aback, though, when she enters the parlor and sees that it is full of stuffed birds. Norman speaks about his hobby of taxidermy and how else he fills the time around the motel. Marion is doing a bit of light teasing and flirting, and we come to realize that Norman seems quite isolated from the world, apart from his mother. As he says, a boy's best friend is his mother, which leaves Marion speechless, understandably. Norman asks Marion what she is running away from, but when Marion asks what made him ask that, he backs down and says, I don't know, people never run away from anything. What do you think he meant by that?
I don't know. I was also quite puzzled by it. It almost felt as though it was a little bit of, thinking back, maybe it was a little bit of leakage in terms of he's got his own things that he's running away from, even though he's not running. This sort of personality of his mother that he takes on and is his way of running away from being Norman. And vice versa, going back to Norman helps him to run away from the things his mother's side has done. Yeah, I don't know. It was certainly a very interesting, but I guess in that context, it would have only made her wonder as you said, what does he know about me? And it just, that sort of added to the, I guess, the viewer wondering how much does he actually know? What has he discovered, or what does he suspect?
Absolutely. I love that take. Like, I hadn't even thought about how Norman is kind of running away or escaping without running away. And I think this film leaves it open to interpretation. I don't think there is one interpretation. But I was also thinking, maybe it's just that people take their problems with them. So then Norman says, I think that we're all in our own private traps, clamped in them, and none of us can ever get out. We scratch and claw, but only at the air, only at each other. And for all of it, we never budge an inch. And then Marion replies, sometimes we deliberately step into those traps. Norman thinks before saying, I was born in mine. I don't mind it anymore. And then Marion becomes a bit like activist-y and tells him, oh, but you should mind it. To which Norman responds, oh, I do, but I don't say it. Or I do, but I say I don't. And it was just like this really incongruent communication from him at the time. And even the way he says it, he's laughing. He's like, oh, I say I do, but I don't, as if it doesn't mean anything. But it's actually a deeply tragic statement.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. And so Norman explains how his mother had to raise him by herself after his father died when Norman was little, which is very Ed Gein. She met another man who persuaded her to build the motel. But when he died too, his mother became unstable. And then he's like, and the way he died, but I guess it's nothing to talk about while you're eating, which is, again, like really incongruent communication. Like, it's something, he's implying something very gruesome, but he's making out like it's a joke. Or he makes a joke out of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Norman said it was too great a shock for his mother. She had nothing left. Marianne points out, except you. Norman replies, well, a son is a poor substitute for a lover, which sounds like the kind of thing he's repeating from his mother. It sounded like something his mother would have said to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Marianne suggests that Norman puts his mother someplace, and he once again becomes like still. And then he leans forward asking, someplace? You mean an institution? A madhouse? And at first he's like disbelieving, but this was very interesting to me. He like slowly, subtly changes. Like there's like a slight sneer that appears on his face, and his eyes narrow and his voice becomes like harder and colder. And I was like, I wonder if in this moment we are literally seeing him become mother, because he speaks, because then he says, like, what do you know about caring? Have you ever seen the inside of one of those places? The laughing and the tears and the cruel eyes studying you. It was like, it didn't sound like Norman. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. And it also seemed as though he was certainly speaking from experience, which I think was giving us a clue into what he might have gone through during his own childhood or adulthood that we did not yet know about him, that he was so affronted to this idea of an institution.
Yes, he described it in great detail. And I was also like, it sounds like he has experience of this. Like, I wonder if he was, spent some time in a place like that. Is there anything else about this scene that stood out to you? What do you think about Marion in this scene?
I think, throughout I sort of get the feeling that she's trying to get this over and done with and get her food guzzled down so she can get out of there. And I think that's maybe because she's a little bit uncomfortable around him, but also more because she's maybe concerned that she's going to say something that's going to sort of break her cover, or let him in on something, or what she's done. So she does strike me as quite uncomfortable throughout. From his side, it's quite, I wonder if at times it feels like he's interested in he clearly knows that she's done something that is wrong or bad. And he seems to be almost connecting with that side of her, and this might be sort of projecting, but him maybe wondering if she's also done bad things, maybe she can look past my bad thing that I've done.
That's a very romantic take, Nicole.
Well, then he goes
um,
and kills everyone. So,
well, not him.
yeah,
Not
oh no,
that.
of course, yes.
I mean, it is obvious that he's trying to connect with her and that he finds her attractive. I hadn't considered that, maybe he was hoping that, her dark secret would help her to overlook his dark
Mm,
secrets. I think that's very interesting.
mm,
But I agree with you. She was it was almost like she was taking a bite and thinking like, okay, have I eaten enough now that, it would be polite to leave? Like, how much more do I have to eat?
yeah.
And then you can see when he becomes, I don't know, when that change comes over him, when he becomes not the charming,
Mm,
affable Norman that we know,
mm,
you can see the fear in her eyes, and it happens so quickly, and she's like, oh, I'm not as safe as I thought I was right now. Like, I need to get out of here.
mm,
She has unburdened herself in the sense that she's made that decision. All his talking about traps, making her realize, oh, I don't want to end up
mm,
as trapped as someone like Norman.
yeah,
So I'm going to
yeah.
go back and come clean. Now it's time to rate Psycho on our 5-point Fanon test for mental health representation in media. You can think of it as the Bechdel test for psychology. But instead of focusing on gender, it zooms in on the presence and the quality of mental health representation. So it is named after Frantz Fanon, the West Indian psychiatrist, the Pan Africanist, and Marxist who developed our understanding of decolonization and the psychopathology of colonization. The test consists of 5 scales, each with one question contributing 1 point, leading to a total score of 5. So each scale of the test is also named after a thinker who has contributed profoundly to decolonizing and intersectional approaches to mental health and society. If you want a full explanation of the test, go listen to my previous episode in the series. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And so let's start with the first scale, the Cooper scale, named after South African psychologist Satisvian Cooper. So, are mental health phenomena depicted and named with clarity? I would give this film like a quarter point for it
Mm,
because, yes, they did name. I mean, did they even say schizophrenia? I don't think
mm-mm.
so.
No,
No.
no, I don't think
So there was like a psychiatrist explaining
so. Mm,
what was happening,
mm,
sort of, but the explanation felt very, tacked on at the end, almost like an afterthought.
mm,
It wasn't very clear in that it did lead to a lot of confusion for decades. I mean, I think
mm,
now people in the US, the TERFs and the conservatives, are still using, this trope of characters like Norman Bates as representations of trans people to, demonize trans people. It wouldn't have had such an impact, I don't think, if it had been described more clearly and explained more clearly.
yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't ignore like the mental health phenomena, but it also doesn't really do it very clearly. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you there. It does. It certainly. I mean, it could have been worse. They could have just had a scene where they said he was a crazy psycho killer, and that was the end of it.
Mm.
There was some attempt with given whatever tools they had at the time to navigate the psychology behind it, but certainly in retrospect, it was not the best attempt and not the most helpful attempt either.
Yeah, I agree with you. Also, when Norman was sitting in the jail cell, they gave him a blanket. They treated him with kindness, which was, I was pleased to see. They didn't treat him badly because he was mentally ill.
Absolutely, I agree.
Okay, so the next scale is the Hill Collins scale. Are characters diverse and shown as whole people without stereotypes or diagnoses? I'll let you answer first.
Again, it's difficult. I try to, if I answer this, I try to put myself both back then and now. And I didn't live back then, so it's difficult for me to do that. But I think certainly Norman, at least, was always portrayed almost as, even if just retrospectively, as a product of his diagnosis and a product of what was going on with him psychologically. But there were certainly attempts. They definitely could have made the women, female characters were at least less subservient than we've seen in other movies of the time. They were certainly more of antagonists and moving things forward in the movie. So I guess maybe also a quarter point for that, although there was still some problematic stuff for me.
Yeah, I agree. A quarter point for all the reasons you mentioned, and also there's no like diversity in the cast at all. It's just white. It's like the whitest movie I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And then the Crenshaw scale: does the story acknowledge and challenge intersecting systems of power and oppression shaping mental health? I was quite impressed with the fact, like, the film did show what it was like for Marion moving through the world as a woman, as an attractive woman, and the vigilance that she has to move through, the harassment that she has to experience. And then with Norman, there could definitely have been more analysis and more perspective of, what is it like running a motel that no one ever comes to and like trying to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Yeah, I was quite interested in, as a person who, the material I deal with is very violent, and I think movies that we watch today, with horror movies and other genres as well, you're almost sometimes opening with the first murder. So I was quite surprised almost that it took so long to get to the first murder. And I think that maybe speaks to a different audience who didn't perhaps need that up front. But yeah, so she certainly was, I think she lasted, she was an ongoing character even after a death in the movie. So, and I definitely agree with what you say about Norman as well.
Are there any other, intersecting systems of power and oppression that were ignored or featured in the film, do you think?
I guess, there was the police officer aspect where they were quite dismissive of, so I guess that would be a legal system power aspect where they were quite dismissive of her sister and Sam's concerns until they started mentioning a few things. But even then, they weren't willing to assist. It was sort of, she's got herself into this, she can get herself out of it type of thing.
Yeah, I think this film, I would maybe give this scale also a quarter point. What do you think? Is that even too generous?
No, I think it's fair. Yeah, again, I think they were working with what they had at the time. So
the child scale: if it depicts mental health professionals or therapeutic processes, including Indigenous or informal ones, are these represented accurately and respectfully? So it does depict a mental health professional. It does not depict any therapeutic processes. It depicts, I guess the only therapeutic process is kind of the feedback to the family, which is a part of care if you're dealing with someone vulnerable. And I certainly don't know of any mental health practitioner who would hold court like that and perform the feedback to the family and be so, what's the word, like oblique and so mysterious about questions. He wasn't like just telling them the facts. He was like, not exactly. And yeah. So
yeah, I agree.
And he was like, yes and no. And I did get the full story, but not from Norman. It's like, just say what is up, dude.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
dealing with like traumatized people who have lost someone, who are grieving and who have been through like the most.
Mm.
Yeah, not a
Yeah,
very good
no, I
representation.
agree. And fastest diagnosis ever. I mean, they were still in the, you know.
Yes. And also I don't know if this is how they do it in America or if this is how they did it back then, but being assessed in a courthouse is also a bit, I don't know, weird.
Mm,
Maybe it's
agreed.
just a very
Yeah.
small town. So, and then lastly, we have the Martin Barros scale, which is does the story and its legacy invite meaningful engagement with ethical issues without reinforcing stigma? I mean, it has certainly invited meaningful engagements.
Mm,
Like all aspects of the movie have, yeah, in terms of not just what we're doing, mental health, but also, the filmmaking style, the gender, all of that. There's so much academia around this movie,
mm.
but it does certainly reinforce stigma around certain
Mm.
populations.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's without a doubt. It starts the conversation, but also does not really give viewers any tools to have a positive conversation around those, sort of leads you in the direction that it believes you should think, which is not terribly helpful.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good explanation. So let's see, we have 4 quarter points and a 1-0. So that gives us 1 out of 5. This film, Psycho, scores a 1 out of 5 on the Fanon test. I would watch Psycho again. I really
Mm.
enjoyed the movie, but in terms of
Yeah.
its mental health representation, it's definitely a fail.
Yeah, I agree with you there, absolutely. And, I mean, I guess, again, we're going back to where we were in the times when this movie was made, and it will be interesting to see how other similar, I don't know any movies around that time that would really get a point for each and every one of those categories. It was simply a work in progress.
You do have to look at films in the context in which they were created.
Mm.
But at the same time, with a movie like this that is still having an impact on
Yeah.
discourse, on people's lives, we have to take its legacy and its impact into account as well.
Mm.
Nicole, thank you so much for being here. Like, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thank you.
Where can listeners go to find more about you and your work?
Sure, thank you. Best place is probably my website, truecrimesouthafrica.com. There you'll find links to the podcast on any of your listening platforms and then also the books.
Great. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to hear more of our discussion about Psycho, as well as some background information on Anthony Perkins, who played Norman Bates, you can check out the full extended version of the episode on Patreon. Until next time, remember, everyone has the right to live with their optimal mental health. Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectionalpsychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsych.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at intersectional psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and intersectional psychology are committed to the Cite Black Women praxis. All episodes of intersectional psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health